Well, thanks. It's an honor to follow on from the talk where Matthew talked about some of the work and the games he's done back in the day. Phil and I paired up to actually get a hold of the disks that contain the source code for some of these games and try and extract them. So this talk is about the challenges of dealing with very old media, some of which don't want to be extracted, and trying to get the data off them. And here they are again. Here's the discs, historical artifacts. And these discs have actually had quite the journey. Just briefly to go through the history here of the emotional journey we've all had with these discs, actually. So about 20 years ago, Arcadian actually purchased some UIM artwork from Matthew. And memories get a little hazy after 20 years, and the belief was that the discs had also transferred to Arcadian in that transaction. So when in March 2020 that belief was expressed that Arcadian had the discs, Arcadian was most surprised and expressed that he didn't have the discs. At this point, discs are lost. No one knows where they are, and that's obviously, for discs of historical interest, that's distressing. But then January 2021, up pops ACP, who's just done a bit of a clear out due to a house move, and he's found this box of discs, the very discs that we saw here. And the confusion was that both Arcadian and ACP were Acorn webmasters back in the day, and it went to one of the Acorn webmasters, just not Arcadian. But all's well that ends well. We now have the discs, and the discs made their way to Phil, who has a lot of experience with dealing with crufty old media and trying to get the data off them.
I think also I was geographically closer to ACP as well. We didn't really want the discs going transatlantic if we could avoid it.
So some quick takeaways. It may seem strange to start with some takeaways at the beginning of the presentation rather than the end, but these are really important, so we thought we should put them up front. But just to say, your Acorn preservation team is very experienced in disk recovery. We intend to not just tell you that, but show you that in the upcoming presentation. We handle delicate media respectfully and carefully. These things are maybe 35 years old, and if you don't handle them correctly, you can do some damage, and we'll show that we know how to handle these without causing any undue damage. We're also able to extract old disks that might be written off as hopeless using typical methods that most people would use, and we're going to show some of those. Now is the time to send disks to us and have us recover them if you have any historical disks, because these things aren't getting any younger. Quite often I'll receive a disk and the person that sent it to me will say, this read fine 10 years ago, and well, sure, 10 years ago, but today, 10 more years of decay, these things start to fail to read. If you do send us your disks, we have some guarantees we'll make. We will respect your privacy. We'll keep your data private and send it back to only you. And you, the author of or owner of this disk, control any publication. So we can all respect any, we'll recover the data for you, and we'll respect any rules you may have on disclosure, non-disclosure. Please spread the word and help us capture this history before it's too late, before it's decayed. So just some brief notes on disks and drives and some of the do's and don'ts of handling these delicate media. I mean, the short version is just don't take some disk and stuff it in some drive and fire it up, but in a bit more detail. And know your disks. So before you try and extract the disk or put it anywhere near a disk drive, you want to inspect it. You want to look for dents on the outer jacket, or if the outer jacket is deformed, or if the inner lining of the disk is brittle. All of those things, if you don't fix that and you stick a disk in the drive, the act of spinning the disk can sort of drag the disk surface across a dent or a brittle inner lining, and then you've caused damage that may not be reversible. And disk jacket can be replaced, the magnetic particles on the disk less so. Is the disk moldy? Sometimes if you just smell a disk, you can tell that it's been exposed to water or damp at some stage in its life. That's not a disaster. If you catch it early, you can actually clean the disk. And you want to clean the disk yourself, and you don't want to have the drive head cleaning the disk. That can be very bad, because the drive head will scrape across the disk, build up a clot, and that clot can then drag across the disk surface and cause damage. So these are the things you want to look out for before you put the disk near a drive.
Essentially, with if you just mind me dipping in there, what you get with it is a little bit of dirt will come off the disk, drag a little bit more dirt off, and you just get this bigger and bigger ball of scratchy, horrible dirt that's like running sandpaper over a disk. And very quickly you end up with no disk at all and a section you can see through.
So just a picture of what can happen. This is one of my disks. It arrived in a water damaged package. It's just a game, so it's not the end of the world if this disk dies. But sure enough, the disk surface was covered in a fine brown mold. So I cleaned the disk, and even after cleaning, taking the mold off, still the act of spinning the disk left this pattern of rings you can see on the disk surface made by the drive head. But since I cleaned it before I read it, surprisingly, that disk reads 100%. Every single bit of data on that disk is retrievable. That may not have been the case if I had just repeatedly tried to read the disk without any cleaning and clogged everything up. So disk drives. The disk drive is very important. There are a lot of different types of disk drive. Most importantly is you want to use a drive you trust, if only because you've used it a lot and it has, you've grown to know the drive and it doesn't chew up disks and so on. You want the case off so that you can have easy access to the visible and physical access to the drive heads. And after reading each unknown disk, you want to visibly inspect the drive heads and clean them. Keep your disk drive well maintained. But the drive type really matters for at least two reasons. One, which we'll see later, is that different drives have different electrical properties and different capabilities in terms of resolving peaks in the voltage that comes off of the drive head. But perhaps more importantly for preservation, different drives have different friction between the drive and the surface of the disk. So this picture here is a drive I recently acquired that I'm very happy with. It's a single-sided 80-track drive with a very flat, smooth surface for the drive head, sometimes called a bubble head drive, and it's very gentle on the disk. So if I've got an unknown disk that's of great historic value, I will start with a drive that I know is extremely gentle on the disk. Let's illustrate that. This is worth illustrating. So I've got a bonus couple of sound effects here that I recorded with a couple of my drives last night to illustrate the difference in drives in terms of the friction that a given drive applies to a disk's surface. So Phil, if you can give me the silent thumbs up if this seems to be coming through good, okay, just so I know that we're all good. But this is my TAC drive or TEAC drive loading my dodgy old disk. And it'll work better if I turn up the volume. Let's try that again. That's about as much of that as I can take. I'm not sure if you could hear the sort of grinding noise mixed in with some squeaking noises or not, but that is not a good sound. That's and to be clear, I'm glad it came through with the horror that it needs to. That drive is perfectly well maintained, very good mechanics. TAC drives are good mechanically. It's nothing wrong with the drive. It's just that the disk has got problems. So if you hear that noise when you're recovering an artifact, stop. Try a different drive, send it to someone else, just stop. And very quickly for comparison, I'll show you the sound of that same disc, same tracks, using my the tech drive I was just showing you that I asserted had a more gentle nature. So let's play this. So as you can tell, you can hear has a louder hum for the motor, but that's fine. And there was no sound of scraping or screeching. So hopefully that was an audible demonstration that disk drives, even disk drives that are working perfectly, maintained well, have very different properties. So that brings us on to flux recovery. So you've got these disks in your hand, you've done your checks, the disk, the drive, you want to try and get the data off. Your first port of call is going to be flux recovery. Phil used his disk ferret. We actually, the Acorn preservation team, we strongly recommend a grease weasel if you want to get into this. If only because it's currently very well developed. It's got a friendly, active community. It's open source, open hardware, good file format. It just ticks all the boxes. This is the one I have. This picture here, it is known to behave well with the ropey old 5 1/4 inch drives that we sometimes find ourselves with in the BBC world. So when you get your read off of your grease weasel, you can visualize the flux read you get with various tools. This one's called HXC floppy emulator. This is what you might see. So this representation here is one track. It's track 0 of the Tempest source code. We just talked about Tempest in the previous talk. This is the source code disk. This has gone well. Just as a human, viscerally, we can see green. Green is good, right? And that means that things have read well. Straight away, we see that the vertical bars, there's 18 of them. So it's an 18 sector format. That's a little unusual, but when you see that, it's usually a Watford DDFS disk, which it was. And you can also see the 3 horizontal strips of sort of black dots. That's 3 different pulse timings that are present on this track, and that's what you see with double density disks. They fit 3 different timings in to get the double density. This disk isn't perfect. There's a wobble on the second sector, the second green box from the left, where the blobs start to drift towards each other. In this instance, it's okay, but if that drift becomes a collision, then you lose the ability to discern the timing of each little blob, and the disk won't read correctly. So the Tempest source code disk recovered fine first time, all green, great. Sometimes it goes which is red, red, bad. But as you can see here, those clouds of dots have drifted into each other, and that means that there's some damage or blotch on the disk, and we can't read that disk. This is the UIM source code disk, so this is a disk we were keen to read. Fortunately, that's what the picture here is not too bad. Like the size and scope of the failure is just slight. So we actually got this disk to read fine just by rereading a few times. The grease weasel by default reads maybe 3 tracks, reads the same track 3 times. I usually recommend reading it 5 times. I think the second read out of 5 resolved this fine. So this is a disk where the disk has got problems, but without a fuss, we were able to read it. And sometimes things go like, this is the Living Daylight source code disk. So again, we were very keen to get this. This is track 0, or what's left of it. And we've got a bunch of green, very clean horizontal lines, green. But then the first 2 sectors are just a mess, just noise. It's a very interesting disk. Every single sector on this disk is fine, great, apart from the very first 2, which are just destroyed. We've got theories on that. We think maybe a bad drive was used to make a small modification to the disk, and that if you delete a file or something, that writes the first 2 sectors, and maybe the disk was dirty, out of alignment, and it just wrecked the first 2 sectors. And of course, on a BBC disk, the first 2 sectors is where the file catalog is. That's not ideal. and that read is sufficiently noisy that you can reread this as many times as you want, and you using any drive you want, you are not going to get those sectors. So that this is uncool. Let's see if we can do something about that. But before we do, just to note that we, again, on the theme of different drives, different properties, the Repton 3 electron source code disk had some wobbles. Here we see us trying two different drives. Phil tried with a TIAC drive and a Mitsubishi, an older Mitsubishi drive, and the Mitsubishi was actually able to resolve more sectors than the TIAC, which was surprising. But some data we used later on. Not all of the sectors though. Still, we had to resort to some extremes to get the last sector of the Repton 3 electron source code disk. So we've hit the limit of what you can do with a grease weasel or a disk ferret or a quire flux. The flux pulses we're getting from the drive, they're just not low level enough, not enough detail. We'll have to go deeper. So I'll be brief on this section, the drive electronics recap. But I do like it when someone else writes my slides for me. And in 1983, there's this wonderful service manual for the TIAC drive. This is in the days when a service manual will actually tell you how the thing worked and give you some options to actually service things that you owned. But here's the electronics typical of a drive. So on the left, those little coils is actually the coils in the drive head, and the electricity flows through a preamplifier, through a filter, through another amplifier, and then peaks in the voltage are detected, and those peaks are filtered again and then turned into the pulses that come out of the drive. So kind of cool, lovely diagram. And it also shows the test points where you can tap the voltage on the drive at different points in this pipeline. And this is a great diagram. It shows what a disk actually quotes looks like. So at the top, it represents the little bits of magnet on the disk pointing in one way and then pointing the other way. That's how you store the data. And then it shows the voltages that the drive head will read off of the disk. It looks just like the top two waveforms. And then it shows you what the voltages look like after it's gone through the differentiation amp. And then it shows you the digital pulses that will get sent out of the drive. Again, that's another way of looking at the pipeline. There's the recap. The drive head actually emits tiny voltages, microvolts. So the preamp boosts microvolts to millivolts, and then there's a test point, and that's where we're gonna test. So let's grab that test point and see what we can do. Here's Phil's test setup. So you can see he's clipped onto the test points on the drive, and the oscilloscope sees this waveform top right. There's actually a dropout in the middle there. This is actually a disk that we had a lot of trouble with, and you can see that when the disk is damaged, the voltage signal just dies.
We're also, in addition to that signal, picking up what's called the index pulse, which is the blue probe there and the blue trace. And that just tells us when the disk is at the 0 degree rotation position. So we could take multiple readings and stack them up if we needed to. But these test points, just briefly, are there so you can align the drive and set up the read amplifier.
So with this setup, we are now in the analog realm. And here's what the waveform off of the Living Daylights disk looks like, just to recap. So this is the track we're looking at. That's viewed as digital pulses with the trashed sectors at the start. And then there's an analog waveform. You can probably guess where the two trashed sectors are. It's where the signal is noticeably quieter, but still a signal. Just to note that the program I'm using here, amusingly, at least to me, to look at these waveforms is Audacity. That's an audio editor, and it's the first tool I found that actually worked for the job, scrolling and zooming around an alternating current waveform. other tools I found that were supposed to be more for the electronic space just seem to crash or fail. But Audacity, an audio tool, it saw me good. So Audacity, that's an audio tool, right? As well as being a waveform analysis tool. So that means you can just play the disk. And maybe you've wondered what a disk data sounds like, because I'm sure you know remember what the tape sounds like. Or maybe you haven't wondered, but I'll show you anyway. Let's see. Let's play that waveform. We'll try and play that waveform. Whilst I get a reminder to feed the fish. There we go, from Google Home, if you heard that. Okay, that's enough of that. I think you hopefully get the point. You can hear the bee-boo, bee-boo. That's the sync markers before a sector. So you can actually hear some of the pieces you would expect to find on a disk track. So zooming in to the part of the living daylights where we were having problems reading it, this is the same area read with two different drives. Just because we were doing some tests, the top drive, the one type of TAC, had a much weaker voltage signal office analog tap point than the bottom view, which is a much more modern TAC drive. So we use that one. But you can see, if you look at the bottom picture on the left, you've got some pretty clean looking regular peaks. This is just at the start of the sector. And then the signal just starts to collapse in the middle. That's the lead into the sector. And then on the right, you see these chaotic, noisy peaks. That's the sector data. And these things are supposed to look a little bit like sine waves, and this does not. So you can tell why it's understandable the drive, may have had trouble discerning this. You've got peaks with horns, you've got peaks with peaks coming off of them, you've got flat peaks, you've got mess. So the drive can't handle that, but can we? So we took a very simple algorithm to try and recover the peaks from that chaotic signal, based on the knowledge that we know what we're expecting to see. We're expecting to see BBC single density FM encoded sector data, which is actually really simple. Every 8 microseconds, there's a data bit there plus a clock bit. The data bit is either 0 or 1, and if it's 0, you expect to see the voltage drift just generally in one direction, either down or up. And if it's a 1 data bit, you expect to see the voltage go up and down, or down and up. And that is a very easy algorithm to apply. Visually, it looks a bit like this. On the bottom is a zoomed in waveform, and you can see how messy it is here in many ways. And on the top is just whether it's a 0 or a 1 data bit based on the algorithm I described. Like, is the voltage generally going in one direction, or is there like a double direction in a given time slot? So I ran that algorithm on this analog waveform for those two sectors from the living daylights, and bang, not first time, I had to make a tweak, but second time, minimal fuss, out came really clean looking sector data. I think it's correct. How do we know it's correct? Most critically, there's a CRC on the disk. This is how disk errors, the dreaded error E, is detected. There's a 16-bit CRC on the disk at the end of a sector, and you can compute the CRC from the bytes we've recovered, compare it with the one on disk, and it matched fine. And there's pretty minimal chance of accidentally, pulling noise off the disk and matching the CRC by fluke. We can also do a sanity check. We know what DFS catalog sectors are supposed to look like. We know what alphanumeric file names are supposed to look like, and it all looks pretty okay to me. So this was quite encouraging. We also used the same technique to pull one of the sectors out of Repton 3 source code disk to complete another disk using this technique. So it's pretty powerful, and it worked well. We were quite pleased. There's one disk left. One disk remains to be recovered, and this disk has not had the gentlest of lives. At some stage, it took this moderate-sized dent. If you're curious how big a track is in terms of just the visualization of a track on the disk surface, well, this dent is 11 tracks worth of track size, and there's a major signal dropout in the vicinity of this dent.
In terms of physical size, it's about 5 millimeters from tip to tail.
So at the time we were looking at this, the best drive for signal we had was the modern TIAC drive. And on the top is the signal we got from the drive head. And this is differentiated. So we merged two signals into one to get a cleaner signal. And this is the best we got. That's like we're down into like the less than tens of millivolts, single digit millivolts here. And you see the signal collapse pretty thoroughly here. This is track 19 of one of the Electron source code disks. But as a human, you can look at this and still sort of see ups and downs, right? But some of the ups and downs are missing. But we looked at it, and it became clear that the ups and downs are present for a 0 bit. So 8 microsecond wave is still representable at this quiet volume, but there's not enough bandwidth in this signal to represent 1 bits where that's a 4 microsecond difference between up and down in the voltage. But for the bits that are too weak, it's just sort of a blare, a horizontal blare. But that is still differentiatable, right? You can, as a human, you can look at that and say this is a peak and this is a blare. so we're still able to get zeros and ones out of this. So I went into Audacity, and where the signal's a bit hard to parse for a program, I drew, again, this is an audio editing tool, just drew the peaks in by hand. This is the bottom view now. You can see the sharp lines where I've gone and drawn it, got my crayons out, run it through the recovery, and this sector, we recovered it. Again, we've got every bit in the CRC matched. So we're getting towards the extremes of the analog realm now and still managing to recover disks. To be continued. However, we're not done with this disk. One of the tracks in the middle of the dent, for example, here, track 24, I guess the previous tracks were bad. This is like super bad. The signal sort of drops out, recovers again. We think the tip of the dent still has contact with the with the disk head, so the signal recovers in the middle like an island of stability and then collapses again. And if we zoom into the collapsed signal on the right side, and then look at the bottom here, the signal just falls to noise. I don't think even as a human you can reliably discern zeros and ones from this wobble. It's like a 4 millivolt wobble at this point. So that is frustrating. There's not to say we've given up. 9 sectors left to repair, and the signal is just awful on these sectors. We currently suspect that the data was written after the dent was formed, and the reason for that is that we flattened the dent carefully, of course, and the signal didn't really improve. So there's some evidence to suggest that maybe the dent was there, then the data was written, and so there may have been poor right head contact at the time of the write, causing a weak signal that's going to give us trouble. We're still trying. I have some optimism. We're experimenting with different disk drives. Different drives appear to have different capabilities in the filtering and preamplifier stages. Phil has a Mitsubishi that's it's promising. Also, the physics of magnetism are that if you spin a disk faster, the volts you can pick up off of the drive head will increase. The signal to noise might increase if you're lucky. So we're trying with that. And there's always options like constructing an expensive, fancy, modern preamp and sticking that electronics onto the drive. So there are options here that we're we're pursuing. I'm vaguely optimistic we might eventually get this data, but I think we're at a physical limit here, like in terms of, is the entropy still there on the disk surface or not? So in terms of what's next, all of the source code and data we've recovered, which is everything apart from a few sectors on one of the Repton 3 disks, has been provided to Matthew. We do encourage authors, when we send them materials that we've recovered, have a good look through, see if it's all there. Let us know if it's not. Let us know if there's any errors. Let us know if the source is still buildable and maybe even modifiable. And then checking that there's nothing inappropriate or sensitive in the data, you can consider releasing it. And that brings us on to Q&A. I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on what we've done, any questions, or any disks, please, any disks to offer us to recover, given that we've shown that we can go to some depths to recover really quite decayed disks.
No, just a marvelous presentation. The only thing what you can do is hell of a job this.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I just want to put this light off. It's a bit bright. So I've got a grease weasel, and I've got some old discs that I'd like to recover. Now I don't really want them to put them into a disk drive as much as I'm going to try to limit the amount of times I want to put it into the drive. So I really kind of want to try and do it in as short a space of time as possible. So I've been practicing on disks that I know are not important. But the question is identifying the format. Is it 40 tracks, 80 tracks, the different things? I've started using the tools for looking at for reading the disk and then analyzing it. Yeah, it's not very intuitive. So I've been trying to kind of find some extra information online. So it was interesting what you were saying about the different timings and the ways of identifying the number of sectors and other things. But with regards to things like that, kind of identifying, so if you've got a disk, how many tracks is it, that kind of thing. What's the sort of guidelines there?
Yeah, this is something that I want to release to ABug, a sort of guide on how best to recover disks, including things like worrying about how many tracks it has and so on. The short answer is that when you're not sure what disk you have, just capture it using the grease weasel in the maximum detail the grease weasel can handle, and then tooling later will sort out whether it's a 40 track or an 80 track disk. So so if you're not sure, capture. I always capture a disk as 80 tracks. It is easy to discard the interim tracks if it turns out it's just 40 track, but you can't invent the interim tracks if you get it wrong the other way around. So yeah, the guideline will be capture 80 track. In terms of identifying it, that tool I was showing, HXC floppy emulator, will load an SCP image and you can look through it. It's usually pretty clear if it's a 40 or 80 track disk, because the in-between tracks will read with errors or noise if it's a 40 track disk. And in terms of identifying if it's single or double density, you can tell from the number of sectors. So these things do tend to pop out, but the key is just to capture it with the maximum resolution you can, and then worry about what it is later, I would say.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I've got a Kamana double-sided 4080 track switchable, and I've got a number of other drives as well. So what I was going to say is it a 4080 switchable? Is that a good device to use, or should I be using something that is a dedicated 80 track, or does it really not matter?
A 4080 switchable, you're better off sticking that to setting that to 80 tracks and leaving it there.
Right.
The 4080 switchable drives are meant to read 40 track discs and write 80 track discs. A lot of people use them for writing 40 track discs as well, but the problem there is they'll only write towards tracks, so sometimes those discs won't read on 40 track drives. This is why we're saying read them as 80 track. Because the only two kind of situations you can get when you do that is you either get the same data on two tracks, or you get the data on one track and nothing on the next.
Okay,
That's
good. That's kind of eased my mind quite a bit there, to be honest. I can just read them all as 80, because I was unsure whether I had to work out what a number of tracks it was, and then in the process of doing that, I've maybe read it a couple of times, 2 or 3 times or something. But if I just read them all as 80, then I can work out more detail after that.
If we're talking 5 1/4, the only ones you would have problems with on a BBC disk drive are the 1.2 meg PC format, which needs a high density drive. But if you capture 80 tracks, both sides, so side 0 on the bottom, side 1 on the top, you'll get everything that's on that disk. If it's high density, you'll see that it's kind of getting data, but it's too fast for the drive to deal with. And you can send us the image, we'll tell you if that's happening. The 1.2 meg drives are actually the easiest to find at the moment, as they were in just about every PC going.
Okay.
Certainly for that time period, anyway.
Yeah, they're all 5 1/4 discs, and the drive I'm using is a 5 1/4 Kamana from the kind of the BBC era. Was used on a BBC. Is that a good drive to use, or should I be getting a kind of more modern sort of PC type drive?
We've actually had mixed results with more modern drives. Some particular models of drive we've noticed that post around about 2000, the quality just took a nosedive. They seem to have been leaving the factory with the heads improperly aligned. The Kumana drives, a lot of the BBC drives are much of a muchness, because these drives, when they were selling at that point, they were several £100 each, and the manufacturers were putting a lot of effort into getting them right. Kumana made those drive boxes out of several different manufacturers' drives. It's hard to tell what you've got without taking the lid off and actually looking. I've got a TEC drive here, and there's a nameplate on the back that tells you what the drive actually is. That's the bit that matters, not that it's a Kumana.
It's a Shin-on, that drive.
We haven't tried a Shin-on, so I don't know off the top of my head how good they are.
I've just shared the screen if you can see it. Visual floppy disk. This is what, just to show you the 80 track 40 track thing. This is actually a 40 track disk, but as always we've captured 80 track. So this is track 0, and then if you go to track 1, it's just like a kind of a pile of noise, right? This is what you might see if you capture a 40 track disk as 80 track, and then you step again, there's the data, you go again, there's noise. So that's what it looks like. That's how you can tell visually that you're looking at a 40 track disk. And the tooling will easily strip out these interim tracks if you want to make a nice 40 track SSD image or something like that.
If you look at edit,
that's been really helpful. Thanks.
If you just look at the edit tools under the on the bottom right there, there's one to remove the every even track. It's either every even track or every odd track. You've got options for both, I think. And then there's another one to erase side 1 if it's a single-sided disc. So you use those 2 features for a 40-track single-sided disc, and then when you hit export, you'll get you save it as a .img file, and then rename it as a .ssd, and that's single-sided disc, and that should load into just about any reasonably modern BB emulator.
That's great, thanks.
Okay, I've got a question in from chat. Ed S asks, is there any way to nudge the header fraction of a track width to one side or the other, and perhaps combine the readings taken at different offsets?
This is something we're looking into, but not for that reason. Thanks for giving me another reason to do it. We were looking at putting a trinamic stepping motor driver onto the head stepping motor of a 5 1/4 inch drive, and the reason we want to do that is to create alignment discs, because you just there is a spiral track that's used to align the read head, and you can't create that any other way. What I didn't realize until you mentioned it was that we could potentially step the drive in, if needed, 1/128th of the track increments, and take a read. So that might be something we need to look at. Certainly one of the Apple II projects does exactly this and reads at quarter track increments. And they do it because the Apple II drives actually can do that in hardware. It's something we'd be looking into, I think.
So yeah, we've got time for one last question now, and I believe Vectorize is going to ask in person. So,
can you guys see me and hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So I have a question about the actual drive heads themselves. They're sort of little white squares, and they tend to have a line running across them. So I had a drive, I put a disc in it, and the surface came off the disc and clogged up the drive heads. I tried to clean the drive heads with IPA and a cotton bud, and the drive heads no longer have the little horizontal line across them. They're just a plain white square. So are those little black lines across the head, are they important, and have I totally destroyed the drive, or is it going to be okay?
I would get a disk you don't care about and try and format it in a BBC and see if the drive still works. Depending on the drive, what you normally have on the heads, there are 3 horizontal lines, so they're in this kind of a pattern. So the 2 on the left are the erase heads, and the 1 is the read write head, and they're the actual head gaps. You normally can't rub those off. They're actually cast into the head. So what I suspect might have happened on yours is perhaps the dirt has been redistributed and is now hiding them. Or they're small enough that you can't easily see them. I would try that drive and see if it works.
Yeah, it doesn't. It totally doesn't, but I mean...
Hard to really say without looking at it.
Okay, no, it's just I'm very curious because, like, so many of them, you can see these very, very clear black lines. But everybody I've asked has said, "Oh, they don't matter." So it's like, you know, clearly I can see every drive picture I've ever seen has them. You know, what the hell are they?
The white block is the head body, the casting that holds the head together. They're assembled in a jig, and then the jig is filled with resin or ceramic or some other compound to form the rectangular block that is the head. The exception of the bubble and button heads, bubble head, button head, same thing, which is just cast in resin and is just a smooth button-like surface. But you can see there the metal lines that are the head itself. If those are gone, you've done something pretty cataclysmic to the head. And quite how you've done that with a cotton bud and IPA, I'm not sure, unless the cotton bud has somehow caught an exposed edge of the head and pulled it out. But even so, I'm not sure how you've done that to both heads.
Yeah, if you can see the what I've shared, Adrian, you can see those 3 lines that Phil described. On the bottom is the read-write single line. On the top is the erase head, and yeah, those are, I've always found those to be like a chunk of material with some thickness embedded down into the cast, and if that's gone, I'm at a loss to explain what has happened there. like Phil.
Interesting. Okay, we'll take this offline, and I'll see if I can get some detailed photos of it or something, because I was surprised to see them disappear as well. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks.
Just to touch on head cleaning, if you can get hold of a 5 1/4 inch, or if appropriate, a 3 1/2 inch cleaning disc, that is about the best way to clean them safely. Excuse me. The best thing we've found for cleaning them isn't actually 99% isopropyl, it's 70%. But you can water down the 99% to 70%, ideally with distilled or deionized water, but the amount of tap water you're using, unless you're in a hard water area, it's not going to be a big deal. And the reason for that is if there's something water-based on the head, the water will react with that. If there's something oil-based, the isopropyl will react with that and clean it off. If you can't get a cleaning disc, then for a single-sided bubble head drive, you've got a lot of options. Things like foam swabs. You won't be able to catch the head on a bubble head drive because it's coated in resin. Cotton buds will work fine. I prefer the foam clean room swabs because they don't have little bits of cotton that can come off, and they will also bend slightly if you apply too much force. On a double-sided drive, you have to be a lot more careful, and the manufacturers actually tell you explicitly not to do that. You have to use a cleaning disc on those, ideally. But obviously, these are getting very hard to find, and we're looking into alternative means of cleaning these discs, but I'm not comfortable saying, do it this way without a few more miles on the clock.
Okay, we're going to have to finish now, I'm afraid, because we're 3 minutes away from the high score challenge. Just got to thank, obviously, Phil and Chris for the amazing work they've done. I wonder if Matthew's still on, if Matthew's got any final words about, about what he's seen today.
Well, I'm quite amazed that you were able to recover everything, because some of those discs must have been in excess of 35 years old. And I'm very grateful to you both for enabling me to see what sort of a program I was back then. So thank you very much.
Very much welcome.
And it's worth obviously thanking Matthew. And we'll hear about Matthew's future plans for the recovered files in the future. Need to thank Andrew Poole as well for piping up with the discs, solving the mystery, and sending them off to Phil to be dumped. Obviously, these guys are at Scary Beasts and at Phil Pem on Twitter, but would much rather, and I'm sure they'd rather than contacting on Twitter, you use the Stardot channel. So we're very active on the Stardot Discord server. There's a software preservation channel in there. And of course, we've got the Stardot forum, and there's several forums within the forum, such as software preservation, archive submissions. You can find us in there. Now, we normally reserve the rounds of applause for the industry veterans. I'm sure you'll all agree these guys deserve it for the work they've done today. Well, over the last few weeks, and for putting the presentation together.
Okay, so at the end of last Saturday's session, we did threaten that this work was to be continued. So here we are a few days later, continued, just to show how this work concluded. So let's recap where we got to at the end of the presentation last Saturday. And we have to cast our mind back to this dent that was causing us a headache. To go into a bit more detail about this dent, exactly 11 tracks on the disk faulty thanks to this dent, all on the 7th physical sector on the track. That is tracks 19 to 29 inclusive, and there's a major signal dropout when you try to read across this dent. The drives cannot read it through a flux tool like a grease weasel, so we were dropping down to analog techniques to try and get this data off. But the signal dropout, even at the analog realm, was really quite severe, so we're having a headache here. Some good news, just checking in on these sectors individually. The sectors on tracks 24, 5, 6, 7 are actually unused by any DFS file. And sort of looking at what appears to be there, it's just some stale data from a previous file on the disk. Doesn't look to be anything interesting in those sectors. And given that these sectors aren't used by any of the source code files, we decided we can put those aside for now and declare victory if we can just get all of the actual DFS source code files. The sector on track 19, we'd already recovered by hand drawing the peaks, as we saw in one of the slides previously. So the remaining work to finish all of the disks to get past this dent is recover one sector each on tracks 20, 21, 2, 3, and 28. So enter the MITSI, Phil's MITSI drive. To be very specific about the drive that Phil found and was trying with, it's a Mitsubishi M4853. That's an older style drive that doesn't yet have the twist lever to open close, but has sort of a push it to open close. But specifically within the M4853 models, there's a submodel with a board labeled NAMFM, which we think is significant. But that's the drive involved here, and it's a great drive. It's old enough to have a variable resistor for motor control, so that's significant, as we'll see in a minute. But it's new enough to have this little square custom ASIC for the preamp, which we also think is significant. And thanks to the motor control you get on this drive, Phil did some tests, and cranking this little resistance going into the motor control to one of the extremes got the drive spinning at 400 RPM. And why would we do that? Well, the physics of the situation are that the strength of the voltage induced in the drive head is proportional to the rate of change of the magnetic field. So you spin the drive faster, you're hopefully going to get a stronger voltage induced in the drive head, and that may improve your signal to noise ratio. So let's look just how good is this Mitsubishi drive. So this is less about how fast we're spinning it, and more just about the drive electronics. So this is an older Mitsubishi drive, as just described, versus a much newer TIAC drive. So who is the quote winner for our use case of very bad signal dropout? So the top analog waveform you see is the signal coming off the TIAC drive, raw. It's noisy as a mess, right? And this section that we're looking at in all three cases is the section of the disk that is where the dent is, like the worst part of the middle of the dent, where the signals drop down to like
single-digit millivolts.
Yeah, single-digit millivolts peak to peak. So the TIAC is struggling. Its drive electronics are struggling to give us a differentiated signal of these peaks. But the good news is with modern tech, again, we're in Audacity here, and it took me too long to realize this, but you can just run a filter, a low-pass filter on the waveform, and that will iron out the noise using modern tech. So the next in the middle, what we're seeing there is a filtered TIAC signal. So it's a lot better. Some of the peaks, you know, are nice sine waves now, and you can tell if it's like a long gap or a short gap. But towards the right-hand side, it sort of degenerates into wobbles that are it's not easy to tell if that's a 0 or a 1, and indeed the data may not be there. Right at the bottom, this is the signal we got off Phil's Mitsubishi drive, and this is unfiltered. And you can, for a similar section of disk, and you can see just how much better it did. There's only one section where the bits are indeterminate, and that is the section towards the right again, where it's sort of the sine waves collapse into just a sort of a little bit of a wobble, and that's about 2 or 3 bits worth of problem there. And as you can imagine, that is when you're trying to reassemble source code, that's really easy to see what those bits are supposed to be just by looking at the context. In this instance, I think that there was a bit drop out in the middle of a variable name, and it's obvious what the variable name is from surrounding context. You fix it. Does the CRC match? Yes, first time. So you're confident that that's a full recovery. Again, enabled just by trying different drives. And this slightly older Mitsubishi just has something great about it. I'm not sure what it is. It could be the drive head. It could be the preamp. It could be there's a filter after the preamp. Just something different that just does really well. So this was a great find.
I think for me, it's probably a combination of factors.
So yeah, we'll probably be documenting what exact drive this is, and maybe just trying a few more Mitsubishi models just to try and get some more data on this. But
is this before we tried speeding the drive up? It is. Isn't
that's
it?
that's with the speed up. But given that this, I think it would be. I think it's not the speed up that's the difference. The speed up would just is some number of percent in terms of the signal size that we'll get off of it. I think that even a bit slower, that would look really clean apart from those few bits.
The big thing is, though, that what we're seeing is that the high frequency edges where you've got pulses close together are getting attenuated by the filter in the drive, as there is quite a sharp cutoff filter that does exactly what the middle waveform is to the TAC.
So to finish getting the data off, track 23 is the worst track. And even this Mitsubishi drive of awesomeness at 400 RPM with modern post-processing filtering still gives a little bit of trouble. So this is the analog signal for that. As you can see, it's sort of strong before the dent on the left, and goes very weak and after that before it gets strong again to the right. And some of the weak bits, if you zoom in, it's pretty clear. If you've got a short peak or a long peak, you can get the bits out. But it gets a bit tenuous in the middle there, the bit that's highlighted in white. That's about 504 microseconds of standard disk rotation speed, which is 8 bytes. 8 bytes of dubiousness. I think the data, if you sort of get used to how the slightly weak data looks, I think the bits might still be there mostly, but it's really hard and a bit of a headache. So instead of struggling with those 8 bytes, let's get a boost from cross-referencing. So again, the context of what we're recovering is very useful. In this instance, we're recovering the Electron source code for the editor. And the file in question has some similarities with the BBC source code for the editor, which we've recovered fine. So on the left is a dump of the bad sector on the Electron disk, where it goes bad, you can sort of see it sort of fails after a branch of carry set lower, load A80, and then it sort of goes to noise. So if you sort of match that up to the source code we've already recovered from the BBC world, if you look at line 2480 on the right hand side, that appears to be exactly where we are to a precise match. And to cut a long story short, trying those 8 bytes that follow in that dodgy gap in the previous slide and sort of putting them in, does the CRC match? Yes, it did. So recovered. It wasn't quite 100% as trivial as that. If you notice that the 8 bytes that were sort of dubious cover a line number, a basic line number, and the line numbers differ between these two source files because it's different source. So obviously, I was lucky enough to spot that ahead of time. Notice that in both cases, the basic line numbers are going up by 10, and put in the correct basic line number as appropriate, and it matched first time. So that's how we recovered the last trickiest track across that dent. So to summarize the entire project, we've recovered every single file fully, from about 20 disks of Matthew Atkinson's source disks. A few unused sectors on these disks are left on the table, but they're parts of overwritten files, do not appear to be particularly interesting. Probably recoverable, but the benefit of doing so is quite low. The cost will be high, so we're not going to do it. We're calling this project successful, fully recovered, and we're happy for that. We're also happy that Phil and I feel like we've generally developed a powerful recovery process, and we are very keen to reuse it to recover other historical artifacts. And all we need you to do is spread the word, feed us the disks. Thanks for doing so. And that brings us to any additional Q&A people may have.
Did I understand that you got the waveform and then you edited it in Audacity, or did you just view it in Audacity?
Yes, that's a great question. So for some tracks, we could just view it in Audacity to get an idea of where things are, and then as is run an algorithm across the peaks, and they would recover fine. But if we go back to the presentation from Saturday, this slide here shows that there were some cases where a human could discern the peaks, but as is, an algorithm would struggle to discern the peaks. So we did have to edit the waveform. So here, the top is the original waveform, where some of the higher frequency peaks, the 1 bits, have dropped out, not enough bandwidth there. But a human can see that they're supposed to be there, draw them back in, and then an algorithm will recover the 0 and 1 bits easily from there on.
And so once you ended up with this modified waveform, how did you then get the data back from that?
Sure. Like this. So this slide here, if you can see this one, is a very simple algorithm we applied to the analog waveform that splits it into 8 microsecond chunks. And for every chunk, it has to make a fairly simple decision, fortunately, if it's a 0 or a 1. And that is determined by whether the voltage drifts generally in just one direction or if it peaks.
Right. So it was software from the waveform rather than, because I wondered whether you were sort of feeding the waveform back into the drive and sort of getting it back that way. Or that was all.
Closer to emulating what the
go on, Phil.
Say closer a software implementation of what the drive would be doing. But the way this is working would be somewhat harder to implement in hardware, and it happens to be a lot more error tolerant than what the drives actually do. The drives actually differentiate the signal, so they track the rate of change and look for 0 crossing, so where it goes from positive to negative. It's a little bit easier if you've got the diagram from the TIAC service manual there, the waveforms.
Yeah, totally. I found this really instructive on how the drive electronics back in the day would work. There it is.
Yeah, so there you go. So you can see what's happening there. You've got a peak. It's differentiating the signal. So it's the same as the mathematical operation there. And then it's looking for where that crosses 0. So you either have a positive or a negative slope. It looks for where the slope is 0.
Right.
But the reason you have the filter in the drive, so we mentioned the low pass filtering, the reason you have that is because that circuit is very sensitive to noise. If you can imagine the kind of effect that a rapidly changing signal would have on a differentiator, it's effectively doing A minus 1. It's subtracting the current sample from the previous, and that's your output. So it is very, very susceptible to that. The way we're doing this decode, Isn't as easy to do in hardware, but is a lot more tolerant.
Good stuff.
Okay, do we have any more questions for the guys? I think that could be it. There's been some comments in chat simply that say amazing work from David T and great stuff from Big Ed.
I think there's an interesting question of where we go from here as well. Chris mentioned that we've got this, we had the 8 missing bytes. Now, if we didn't have that that key, that other piece of source code, which just happened to be the same, that opens the question of what we could have done to recover that data. I think there's some things to look into with regards to using GPU processing, perhaps, to try all the different uncertain bits. We can identify the uncertainty by the read amplitude. We know which bits we're not sure about, so we can apply a mask to that and perhaps run several hundred cores of a graphics processor, flipping these bits and calculating a CRC. It's probably not going to be a fast operation, but perhaps it's something to look into there.
I suppose I've got a question. Has this experience made either of you even more confident than you were before in what can be done and what can be achieved in terms of recovering a badly damaged disk?
I'm absolutely stunned that this worked. I would have never thought we could have recovered all of the important data from a disk with a physical dent in it. I took one look at that and my heart sank, and to get this back has been wonderful.
Okay, so that's a hell yeah from you, Phil.
Yeah, that's a hell yeah. I think we now have a better idea what's possible.
Because there's got to be a point where the data's kind of gone. It's been hit so hard, or it's just not there. But it seems this combination of using different drives and knowing which drives are going to work best and all the other jiggery pokery has done it.
I have to. I think there is a point, of course, where something's too far gone. I have to bring out my venerable planetoid disk, early Acornsoft 40-track planetoid disk, notorious for quality issues. And if I get this just right, you can see my face through part of the disk.
We're not getting anything back from that. No way.
The oxide particles are absent, checked out, gone.
That's the that disk must be sort of Wabash grade in terms of quality, perhaps slightly better. But we've even managed to track down a box of those on eBay, and the question is there about whether we can develop a methodology to recover those for people who aren't familiar with the quality issues on those disks. If you know anything about tapes, there's a failure mode called sticky shed, where the glue binder that holds the magnetic particles on the disk fails over time and becomes sticky. The head rides over it and it scrubs the oxide coating off. And then it just sort of cascades a bit of dirt on the head, scrapes more magnetic particles off, and it progressively becomes more abrasive, and eventually the spindle motor doesn't have enough torque to move the disk, and the drive will just go off ready, and you have a disk stuck to the drive heads. So what we're looking at is whether we can do things like baking the disk, like works for tapes, and looking into lubricant coatings that we can spray on the disk to give the head a bit more of a riding, a little bit more of a smooth surface to ride on, and move it away from the data surface a bit. It's all very speculative, but it's there are a lot of avenues we're looking down for to find impossible again, I guess.
Speaking of Wabash, we have a slide, don't we, Phil, Would you rather we didn't lower the tone of the video?
If you wish to lower the tone, please go right ahead. I think it's fair to critique the advert in its own words, and they certainly used the words.
Okay, let me see. So do you want to explain this, Phil? Because you found the advert originally, didn't you?
Yeah. So this US company is sort of crowing from the rooftops about how a Wabash salesman turned up at their office and with a box of these brand new Pinnacle series, fixed all the issues, discs in hand, and they go through a long sort of list of the things they've done to these discs to torture them. They've heated them, left them in a bent the thing every which way, slapped it into the PC, it formatted, it stored and retrieved data, gave samples to people, told them to really go at it, took a quartz halogen heat lamp, aimed it at the disk until it started to smoke and melt, then formatted and booted it and retrieved data. I don't believe that for a second. And if you look at the picture on the right, that is one of these disks. The thing that's on the disk around the window there is a chemical called cyclomethicone. It's a silicone-based lubricant that we were trying out. And even these foam swabs that are designed not to grab, not to rub, to be very, very smooth and very light touch, with this silicone lubricant, we're taking bits of the disk surface off. So I think the words in yellow that I could say them, even though even though we're post watershed, I don't want to say it out loud. But they're. I think the advertising is a little bit. I think it's a bit economical with the truth, perhaps. I'll go on. I'll say it. These discs are shit. They are every bit as shit as the originals. Yeah, that company later went out of business. It's not hard to imagine why.
Well, at least I can put my first ever bleeps into a ABug video in the editing process, so that'll be cool. I think I'll use the BBC Micros beep, boot up beep.
Yeah, that would fit.
Did you say you were working on a way of automatically misaligning the heads to get data back where it was originally recorded slightly off?
Glad you brought that up. I'm not actually looking at it for that reason. I'm looking at it from the angle of, if I have a drive that I know is absolutely bang on aligned, how can I transfer that alignment to another drive? So I'm looking at making alignment disks. But the same kind of hardware would give us the ability to microstep the drive down to 1/16 for the track if we wanted to. So we could very easily take a read of a disk at 1/16 for the track intervals and merge the analog recordings to get the strongest signal. So it's definitely a possibility if we have, as you say, have a disk that shows signs of misalignment.
What about if you've got dropouts as well? I don't know how small the dropouts could like certain bits be missing on 1/16 of a track away, but be present the other side of it.
Oh yeah, that would be misalignment, or potentially the head not being in full contact with the disk. And if we've got 16 reads at different intervals, then we can take the best one. We can do math operations. We can line the tracks up and average the result add, subtract. We can do all this in software without rereading the data and just try things until we end up with a result that gives us the data back. So there's a lot of scope within the field of digital signal processing, things like zero phase shift filters, digital filtering, that open up a lot of opportunities that you just don't have with flux images.
Yeah, I should add that my peak recovery algorithm is terrible by modern standards, right? very, very basic and naive, and we didn't even have to crank out the better mathematical models to extract peaks. Like there's a question from Big Ed in the chat about partial response, maximal likelihood, peak recovery. We could certainly do things like that. We could I don't know. These days you use AI, don't you? You train something on what's a 0 and what's a 1, and
well, I would love to look into PRML, and I actually did when I was developing the disk ferret. The problem with PRML is that a lot of the algorithms seem to be locked inside the castles and towers of hard disk manufacturers, or the people who designed them many years ago. The early algorithms have disappeared or sadly passed away. So it's hard to find good references on PRML. But if anyone knows of any good research papers on it, I'd love to sit down on a rainy winter's day sometime and read through them and see if there's something we could do.
Yeah, I think all of these questions are showing that there, as we got this data successfully, there was still a lot left in the tank to go to bat if we hit a tougher case. Just the statistical models in software, I think will get us further. I think we definitely haven't tried the full range of drives that were manufactured. You know, we found this Mitsubishi by luck that just happened to be better than this modern teak thing. But there's a lot of drives out there we haven't tried. What we also, if you look at a drive, the head has a little ribbon cable coming off it. We could plug that, and that's where the microvolts come off. We could plug that into a modern $300 preamp that will have much less noise than 1980s tech, right? There's a lot we could do if we really wanted to go even deeper on.
Play around with the analog interface to the head, and does loading it with a resistor make it any better? Does it respond better? What about capacitive loading? Things, matching the head to the amplifier, and really go to town on it. That could be, months or years of effort doing that. I'd like to personally look into, well, to wind back a little, I think there's a gap in the, I think calling it a market is a little bit of a stretch, given it's mostly open source code, but there are tools like HXC, which are brilliant if you're working with disks that are in perfect condition and perfectly recoverable. It's a wonderful tool for turning a box of disks into HFE files that you can use on a GoTech, but its capacity for data recovery is very limited. So I think what we could do with next is a tool to do digital data recovery, and then extend that perhaps to do analog as a bolt-on. And this is kind of harking back to what I wanted to do many years ago with the disk ferret, but just sadly never ended up happening at the time, but might end up happening now. We've actually got this evidence that this, there is hope, effectively.
Has electronics moved on enough that you could recover without touching the disk?
That would require hard drive heads, wouldn't it? We're talking about spinning the disk at thousands of revs per minute and floating it on a cushion of air, kind of Bernoulli effect style, aren't we, really, there?
Yeah, electronics have come on, but I would worry that physics hasn't.
No, physics is still obsessing over apples falling on Isaac Newton's head. They never got over that.
It's a good point, though. I mean, the mechanics of a lot of these drives is pretty basic. I mean, I think I think I mentioned it the other day, the pressure on the heads, I know from, not from disc, but working with tape stuff, that can make a huge difference. Just the tension of the tape versus the shape of the head, and just getting the angles right and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it may even turn out that your teak drive just has better mechanics rather than better electronics.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned tape, because the heads do respond very much like tape heads. And if you look back at some of the graphs, the waveforms we showed, you can see where the high frequencies fell off, but the low frequencies fell off to a lesser degree. And that is on tape drives, or specifically audio cassette. You find that that's the sort of issue you have when the azimuth of the head is incorrect. You lose the high frequencies. So that's suggesting that maybe what we're dealing with is misalignment.
Yeah, and then when you're going over a bump, those disk drive heads aren't very well held. They're held sort of to the disc, but if you can twist them around quite easily with your finger, and if they twist while they're going over the bump, then yeah, you'll get an azimuth as well as a away from the disc movement.
Yeah, it's the tension on the head is always a compromise, because you've got competing factors. The tighter you push it against the disc, the better the signal you're going to get, but the more wear you're going to put on the disc, and also the more torque you need from the hub. And if you over torque the hub on a 3.5-inch disc, the metal hub will separate, and that's fatal, at least as far as we know at the moment. On a 5.25-inch disc, it will slip.
The actual twisting of the heads, because they really, that doesn't seem to be very well sort of engineered. It's just like it's on a spring that goes up and down, but it doesn't. The heads aren't fixed in any sort of alignment, are they? They're just kind of hanging there.
We do have the sealed head drives where the head, there's just one head on the bottom, and it doesn't move around on the spring. But the one test we did on that, I'll just bring that up. That's the top drawing here. Just the signal of that drive was a lot weaker. We don't know if that's a fundamental property of the sealed head drive. Maybe the sealing increases the distance between the magnetic bits and the head, the read head, or maybe just the drive is has different electronics or different quality head on it. We don't know, but that's the one test we've got so far on it, and the signal was weaker on the sealed head drive.
We do actually have two of those to try. There's one that's being repaired at the moment. We're just waiting for a new head amplifier for. But yeah, the TAC drives seem to be very good if the media is of reasonably good quality, but they aren't the best for marginal media. The Mitsubishi drive that we've been using actually dates back to 1986, so it's not an early 5.25-inch drive. Would have been sort of 5 years prior to that. Would have been probably not the first ones, but the first affordable ones certainly turning up on the market. It's in that happy area where some of the manufacturers had put quite a lot of effort into the circuit design and the head design, perhaps because the quality of the discs was so variable at the time. It would be lovely to talk to one of the engineers who was involved in the design of that drive and just find out what they were optimizing for. But I suspect there is both a language gap there and perhaps a memory gap. It's finding the person who was responsible for it after all these years.
Comment from Ed in chat if you want to have a look at that.
Have a gander. Oh, magnetic force microscopy. Interesting. Care effect.
you want to read that out, Phil, just for the benefit of the recording?
Magnetic force microscopy detects the gradient of a stray magnetic field above the sample surface. Polarized light microscopy uses the Kerr effect, in which the polarization of the light changes due to the magnetization of the sample. So that would be a completely non-contact method. That's an optical readout method. I don't know if anyone's actually tried that. That would be
the Kerr cell. You still want to get it fairly close. I don't know how small they make them these days. The only one I've dealt with was for 1930s television, projection television. They're pretty big, but they weren't that. They were pretty numb as well. I guess they need to be fairly close, still to the surface. But I don't know. There might be fancy stuff now.
It sounds expensive to my totally naive ears, but is this something where you can get a rig together for a reasonable cost?
But the old Kerr cell, it used the magnetic field changed the polarization of a liquid. I think it's like liquid paraffin, the original one. And then all you'd need was a light source and another polarizing filter, and you get dark and bright light through it. So it's probably fairly easy to build. It's just how small you'd have to make it.
I'm just looking at this, and it's atomic force microscopy. A sharp magnetized tip scans across a magnetic sample. I'm just thinking a magnetized tip is probably going to flip bits. Resolutions of 30 nanometers can be achieved. I don't think we really need anywhere near that. The tracks are 0.5 millimeter wide. Off the top of my head, I don't know how large a single bit would be, a single flux transition, but it would be measured in like degrees of an arc rather than millimeters. Magnetic forces between the tip and the sample are sensed. I don't think we're going to get much force there from the field on a magnetic disk. So, I'd want to talk to someone who was an expert in that field and see what they thought to the idea. So perhaps if anyone knows a university lecturer who's into this sort of thing, it would be an angle to approach.
Obviously, at the end of the first one, you signed off with a plea. I think it was Chris signed off with a plea to developers. So, I mean, Phil, do you want to, anybody who might have valuable dev disks, source disks from the 80s, what should they be doing?
If you've got any software disks, game disks, especially source code disks from back in the day, back in the 80s, BBC Micro, Riscos, anything like that, please get in touch with us. I hope the preceding presentation has given you an idea that we know what we're doing. We can recover things, even if the disks have not been stored in the best of conditions. And it would be wonderful to preserve the history of the platform for future generations.